welcome. My name's Tim Caverly. I worked for the Department of Conservation for 32 years. Started my career at Sebago Lake. Eventually went to Rustic State Park as manager, down to Cobscook in eastern Maine, then into the Allagash in 1981. My wife Susan worked for the Department of Conservation for 25 years as a regional secretary. And so we had a great career working for the state of Maine. And now I write books. We have 13 out from pre-K to adult. And we do PowerPoint programs all over New England. This is our newest program. And it came about because of something that happened last spring. Last spring, the Bureau of Parks and Lands, Department of Conservation, was going to spend $1.2 million to put 6 new buildings within the 500-foot zone of the Allagash Wilderness Waterway. And then they were going to buy a patrol boat for Chamberlain Lake with 215 horsepower outboards on it. And that raised quite a stir. And the reasoning was that because there's already rangers camps, that wasn't really wilderness area, which the Allagash is supposed to be. It was just an area that was developed, so it was okay to develop it more. And the rationale behind the 215 horsepower outboards was that they would go slower than a 75 horsepower outboard, so that was actually better for the wilderness experience, which nobody bought.
Right.
And so we're going to talk about the Allagash over the years. We're going to take a virtual trip down the waterway, talk about some of the legends and lures and some of the challenges that the area faces. Many men go fishing all their lives without knowing it is not the fish they're trying to get thereafter. Henry David Thoreau visited the Allagash 1857 with his Penobscot guide Joe Polis, and among other sites they camped on Eagle Lake on Pillsbury Island near what is now called Thoreau Campsite. Today we'll discuss where is and what makes the Allagash a nationally designated wild and scenic river, management zones, organizational structure, what guides Parks Department's management of the waterway, access, threats, history, and challenges, a remarkable story of a river that is still healing from years of being dammed, dug, developed, silted, and clear-cut. And this is our contact information if folks have any questions. Now, my material for tonight comes from these documents. In 2001, this was written by a former president of American Rivers. It's a river of broken promises, talking about the Allagash and the state's failure to manage it for wilderness. This is the Bureau's of Parks management plan for the Allagash. The Allagash has been named one of America's 10 most endangered rivers 2 different times. And this is Losing Paradise, which was written by a national group out of Washington, D.C., discussing the issues that go on the Allagash. So we speak a lot, and a lot of folks don't really know where the Allagash is. They've heard it, and one person said it's just outside of Acadia National Park, isn't it? So we decided we ought to put it here. We live in Millinocket, outside of Baxter Park. 65 miles northwest is where folks put a canoe in and paddle north for 92.5 miles, taking out in Allagash Village. Now, the Allagash actually came about because of a 300,000 acre national riverway. This was going to be everything that was going to be set aside for the Allagash. Because of the Dickey-Lincoln Dam, they were going to flood. Dickey-Lincoln Dam had 3 different proposals. They were going to flood, first off, all the way to Chamberlain Lake. Then they had a different proposal where they was going to flood as far as Churchill. And then the third proposal was they're going to flood as far as West Twin Brooks. And that's why the Allagash boundary line is there today. That was going to be where the final dam, but then they found the furbush lousewort, an endangered species, and that killed the construction of that dam. But the state people, with Ed Muskie, Governor Curtis, still felt the Allagash needed to be protected, and so they created a bond issue. In 1966, through a referendum of the voters of Maine, they were approved by 68%. And then in 1970, the state mandate to develop maximum wilderness character was enhanced when Governor Curtis helped the Allagash become the first state-administered component of the National Wild and Scenic River System under the umbrella of the National Park Service. Bureau of Parks is charged with daily administration. So the Allagash technically has two layers of protection, state law and federal law. And there's Senator Muskie at Churchill Dam dedication. And then Governor Curtis served from 67 to 75, and he was recently interviewed, well, it's 2003, about the founding of the Allagash. And these are his recorded comments. It was the last wilderness river, and we had an opportunity to preserve. Today, more pressure to remote wilderness. Original intent of roading, as only 2 access points were planned. There are too many access points today. It's important to define wilderness if Maine is to comply with federal law. Either need to restore intent or take legal route to determine if Maine is complying with federal law. And we'll always have to fight to maintain intent. The river was to have maximum wilderness character with no development, and buffer zones should be expanded. That's all on tape, on film. And interesting, and when I moved into as manager of Rustic State Park in '72, I was a radio operator for the Allagash, and that was my first experience with it. In the fall of '72, I got a call from the director of parks saying they were firing the very first supervisor, who was Lee Hoare. He was brought out of the National Park Service specifically to manage the Allagash under similar goals of the National Park Service. And so this is an old chart of who has the responsibility. There was the Maine State Park and Recreation Commission. One division was State Parks and Memorials. Another division was the Allagash Wilderness Waterway, a completely different division than State Parks and Memorials. And that's important because when the Director of Parks realized there was going to be a Department of Conservation, he wanted to apply for that job, but he had to get rid of some of his responsibilities. So he turned the Allagash over to Maine State Park, the developed part of the system. And Lee Hoare went to work for the Director of Maine State Parks. And immediately there was friction, and that director is the one that fired Lee Hoare in 1972. He thought that the Allagash should be another state park like Sebago, Reed, or the other parks that are developed. This is Lee Hoare. They recruited him from Shenandoah National Park in 1966 and 67. And in 1996, the Bureau was creating a new management plan for the Allagash. And I asked Lee to comment on that because he's instrumental in setting up the goals that still work on the Allagash today. And he wrote, "Our major concern is that the sense of waterway is drifting from the original purpose." And as we talk, we're going to talk more about that and learn more about that. So my premise is that Maine Parks is trying to force their square peg into the round hole of Maine wilderness. And it's interesting that in 1957, when Governor Baxter was working to establish the Baxter State Park, the Maine State Park Commission immediately started making plans to develop hiking trails, develop parking lots, develop more buildings. And Governor Baxter wrote, he was opposed to it. "These state parks are picnic grounds with all the confusion of trailers, soda pops, and all that. Baxter State Park was created for an entirely different purpose, as I think the Allagash was and should be." There are 3 plans over 54 years: a concept plan written by Lee Hoare, a 1996 management plan, and a 2012 management plan. The objective, page 77 of the management plan, is to manage for wilderness. Unfortunately, these appear to be just words on paper. And so we're going to actually take a canoe trip down the Allagash tonight. We're going to canoe into Allagash Lake, come down the stream, and talk about some of the legends and lures and some of the threats that the Allagash has experienced. And the interesting thing about it, the Allagash is a wonderful canoe trip. It's an experience that people never forget. But if they're on a canoe trip, they're going to cover so many miles a day. So they may not see the group of 40 behind them. They may not see the brook that's been muddied so bad that the developer 4 years ago had to pay a $10,000 fine for putting mud into the Allagash. And so it is a float trip, and it's gorgeous, but unless you're right in tune with what's going on and can learn about it, it can escape, it can be lost. Now there are 3 zones to the Allagash. This is the state ownership, 500 feet wide averaging. This is a new construction zone where the state has control of any new construction on private land. And then this is a 1 mile area where the state can comment or has control over harvesting to protect the feeder streams and the water quality flowing into the Allagash. In 2005, let me back up. This was the first amount of vehicle access points there were to be, 2, one at the beginning, one at the end. By the middle 2000s, the red trucks are the additional access points that's occurred over time, and there's more pressure to add all the time. So we've loaded our canoe and truck and our canoe, and with enough provisions, the last 8 to 10 days, we've driven 95 miles northwest of Millinocket, arrived at Upper Allagash Stream. It's a very hot day, by the way, and so we're going to paddle downstream to get the experience. And we hear a splash around the corner. We don't know if it's a beaver. We can't see it because it is out of our sight. Might be a deer running across the river. So Sue and I get very quiet and we paddle very easily around the corner, and we see this ledge, and this ledge is soaking wet. And there's a black bear right here swimming back to shore. We pull our canoe over into the bushes to kind of hide. The black bear wanders up through the woods. When he gets here, he sits down, slides down the ledge into the water. Now we remain very quiet. He hasn't seen us, so he swims back to shore. We're still over here among the bushes. And he ambles up through the woods. And by this time, this ledge is really, really wet. And when he sits down, he really slides fast into the water. About that time, I reached for my camera to take a picture, and he saw me move and he went in the woods, so I never did get a picture. But it is a story in my book, Solace. Then as we enter Allagash Lake, American bald eagle comes screaming down the right-hand side of our canoe, goes down and smashes into the lake surface, and picks up a brook trout for its own first lunch. This is 4,000 acre Allagash Lake. It's gorgeous. There aren't any motors allowed on the lake or within 1 mile of it from May to October. And so when I get ready to publish a book, before I put it to print, Sue and I go back to make sure our distances are accurate, our landmarks are still there, and any notations that we need to make so it'll make the trip clearer to the people that want to read our works. And so this particular time we was on Allagash Lake, and the whole lake, all 4,000 acres, was flat calm. And you don't see that very often. So we checked everything we need to check and got back to our campsite that night. The stars were so bright, we thought we could stand on a picnic table and pluck one out of the sky. Once our campfire died down, so it was safe to go to bed, we crawled into our tent, into our sleeping bags, and we immediately hear a sound coming from across the lake. The call of the barred owl, which sounds like, "Who cooks for you? Who cooks for you?" Turning it up. So we're in our tent hearing that. The next cove over, we heard the great horn owl going, "Who?" So we're hearing, "Who cooks for you? Who? Who cooks for you? Who?" A classic comedy routine out in the middle of the Maine woods. The next morning, we paddle across the lake to a trail where we're going to climb 180 feet up to go 75 feet down. This is a set of ice caves that were discovered in 1897. And at the time, there were lumberjacks up there cutting wood, and they've been eating beans for 4 meals a day. And they come to this hole in the ground in the wintertime. There's frost all the way around it. They thought it was a bear's den, and they thought some bear meat would go really good with the beans. So they cut up a tree, limbed it to like a ladder, stuck it down in the hole, and they went down until it got too dark to see. They came back out, came back the next morning with lanterns, went down, eventually went 75 feet underground, where they found 4 caverns. And these guys was up there in the early 20s, or the camera equipment of the time went down to that biggest cabin, again 75 feet underground. And they're called the ice caves because it's been said by guides they can find ice down there for the coolest for June and sometimes into July. So we paddle south among the boulders. This is the Allagash Mountain Washington Tower, closed in 1991. And so it really wasn't needed anymore for that kind of work, Forest Use Plains. And then the state decided to replace the cab. Now there's no use for that cab. And so is that development into a wilderness area? Should the cab have been placed there? Irregardless it was. But interestingly, just a few years ago, they put an observation platform up off Trout Mountain overlooking Baxter, and they had an observation platform rather than a full cab. But is that a threat to wilderness? I'm not sure. Just another sign of man's encroachment, I think. Allagash Lake, Allagash Mountain in the background. Heading downstream. I like that photo. Wave at our forest friends as we go. Part of the experience of being in the wild. This is a pine marten, a fur bearer, gorgeous animal, very shy, but very smart, very beautiful. And this is something I use when I go into schools. I talk to kids that go hunting with their parents and brothers and uncles or whoever about the partridge, which is a game bird, white meat, chicken, excellent. This is its cousin, the spruce grouse. This is a dark bird, red over the eye. This is endangered, so people can't shoot it, and you wouldn't want to shoot it anyway because it eats off needles of softwood trees and wouldn't taste very good. So I do this strictly to let the kids know when they go hunting that they can harvest the right bird. 3 miles downstream from Allagash Lake, we come to Little Allagash Falls. That is uncanoeable, so we're going to lug our gear around. But that's okay because there's a brook trout hole right there, so we can catch our own fresh brook trout for lunch. Now, if we'd done this trip in 1946, when we come into Chamberlain Lake, we would have seen this old railroad trestle brought in for a 13-mile railroad track. They had 2 locomotives in there from the 20s to the 30s, and they would haul wood from Eagle Lake north from north on Eagle Lake, across this trestle, where the wood would be dumped into a tributary of the west branch of Penobscot River, where it'd be floated down to the mills from Millinocket south to Bangor. And a few years ago, a friend of mine was going around this old trestle with his canoe, and this lynx came out and walked up a rail. And I didn't think cats liked water, but doing research for my books, I found that the lynx would go swimming, and to go fishing, indeed, that lynx swam across Chamberlain Lake. And the lynx, the reason they're able to survive in the Arctic conditions in the northern Maine is because they have large paws, which allow them to have snowshoe-like activity in deep snow. And the game wardens tell me that bobcats are the first cat to perspire during cold weather. And they think that they don't really know why the lynx have the tufts and the bobcats don't, but they think the lynx are such excellent hunters that it enables them to hear the rabbits and squirrels that they need to eat to survive. Looking south, 18-mile long Chamberlain Lake. This is where folks start the canoe trip, right out in here. This is the arm of Chamberlain. Nugent's is right over in here. And the tramway's up here. So we're going to take a quick plane ride. And we're going to see McNally Brook. I mentioned it earlier. This was muddied because of poor road construction. And it caused enough mud in the brook, so the landowner was fined $10,000 for doing this. And so it's just another thing that you should always watch for when you're up there, because you just never know what effect it's going to have with mud filling up spawning beds and feeding grounds for our brook trout. This is the original log dam, the original outlet to the Allagash. This was a log crib dam that was built back in 1841. that got pretty hard shape, so the state decided to put a concrete dam in. After they put the concrete dam in, according to the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, concrete is not allowed in a Wild and Scenic Rivers area. So that was in violation when they did that, but it's still there. It's almost like the Allagash is just another state park, so we can do what we want. And then as we back on the water, we're coming up into the tramway. This is where an old conveyor system is. The train's over on this end here. And for years, this logging road was blocked at the mile zone. And that if people wanted to walk in, they could, but they had to walk the mile. And then a few years ago, the state decided to expand that road and build a parking lot, and which has allowed more foot traffic to come within a 16-minute walk from the parking lots, which is in here, up to the trains. And I'll tell you more about that in a minute. This is the tramway. It started construction in 1901. It flows between Eagle Lake, west, towards Chamberlain Lake, southwest. And they put logs on here and run it on an endless conveyor system, dumping the wood into the lake, and they used that for about 6 years. It's a very popular site today. A few years ago, volunteers went in and rebuilt a 25-foot section of this old tramway. They put a 20-foot log on up here, run it over land, and then return underneath, the empty return underneath. And they used that for about 6 years, and they estimate they moved 100 million feet of timber across that 3,000 foot piece of land over that time. On the Eagle Lake side of this tramway is the locomotives. And these are one of the two trains that's still left there today, brought in for that 13-mile railroad track. They could carry up to 6,400 cord per trip. And speed was essential because they could only use that so many months a year. And in a book, Rustic: A Century of Logging by Professor Judd, he said that while the trains were rushing to get back and forth to haul wood, that they'd kill up to eight deer a day across that tramway. And these are the two trains. This weighed 110 ton in its heyday, this weighed 100 ton. And they're very, very popular today. And for years, the only way people could get there was either by canoe, by hiking in that mile, but that's changed. So Public Lands, who's part of the umbrella of the Bureau of Parks and Lands, they extended this road in, put a parking lot in here. And Public Lands is supposed to manage their land according to AWW regulations, which controls use and public use in large numbers. And this is the parking lot. That's where the trains is. It's a 16-minute walk. And oversized groups, when the Waterway was first being thought of, there were up to 80 oversized groups with up to 50 people per group taking the trip. And they didn't think that was good for a wilderness experience. That picture was taken in 1963. So they limited the amount of people to 12 people per group. That was enough to satisfy most camp needs, they thought, and again, still be able to maintain or manage for a wilderness area. The Bureau of Parks now, they've changed the laws, so you only need to be reduced to a group of 12 if you're on a campsite or if you're on the water. This is a group that was taken 2 years ago, and they pretty much, you can say they ignored that group size 12 but once they're off the water and once they're not on a campsite like at the trains, they can gather as one, which to me sends a conflicting message. This is a guy that was up there a few days ago. He got to the trains early in the morning. He was the only one there. He was tickled to death. He felt he's experiencing it for the first time, he'd spent his whole life to make that trek. What he didn't know was later that day, a guide from the Presque Isle Ashland area led this group in, and sometimes he's leading in groups of up to 80 to 90 people in mass. This 60-minute walk down to the trains. So people are paying thousands of dollars to take an 8 to 10 day wilderness canoe trip are apt to get to the trains and see this, and the Bureau seems helpless to be able to manage that. In fact, in 2019, North Main Woods said there was 1,600 that visited the trains, and then 2020 that nearly doubled. And then we remember the first inhabitants, Allagash, a derivative meaning Bark Cabin Lake. Machias, Maine is the site of the first naval battle of the American Revolution, and they reenact that every Father's Day weekend. And a few years ago, some natives went down there and built a bark cabin like they would have used on the Allagash. Now they went to the sea or the ocean in the summertime to fish, then went back to the Allagash in the wintertime to trap beaver. And this is a hemlock bark cabin lodge as they would have used hundreds of years ago. And also, they've also actually found signs of tools that Native Americans used to build dugout boats about 9,000 years ago. The birch bark canoes, which I didn't know till recently, were only started being used about 2,500 years ago. The Indians were right there 12,000 years ago as soon as the glaciers left. So we're heading north, and as some say, back into time. We're heading up towards Churchill Lake. And we see a whole bunch of firecrack rock on the beach. Now, when Native Americans lived up there, they often would cook their food using birch bark containers. Now, we know you can't put birch bark over an open fire, but it is waterproof. And so they would build vessels like this, create them, line the inside edge with their food, leaving a hollow in the middle, cover that food with water, then they'd heat rocks, this size, a little bit bigger, red hot. When they got hot, they'd take a fork stick, pick up the rocks, drop it into these birch bark containers, heating the water, cooking the food. While the hot rocks are heating the water and cooking the food, the cold water is cooling off these stones so fast they couldn't stand that rapid loss of temperature. So the rocks, from the stress, would break apart in little bits and pieces. When the Native Americans were done eating, the food would be all gone. They'd want to use those birch bark containers again, and so you simply tip the chips out, because the food would be gone, tip the chips out on the beach, because they weren't of any use. And so these are our rocks used by hundreds of years ago to cook a meal on the shore of Eagle Lake. And there are a lot of spots up there you can still find like that today. If you look around, you might find what I found, a stone axe. This is the cutting edge. This is where the handle was. When I turned that axe over Maine's Historic Preservation for safekeeping, they estimated that axe was 5,000 years old. So there's still a lot of neat stuff up there that's ripe for discovery. We have an old growth forest on Eagle Lake, only 500 feet wide, but at least it's there. And then we pause at Johns Bridge, which is right here. And for many years, the road to Johns Bridge was blocked by 7 islands. And then they opened it in 2002. And a weekend or a couple weekends after they opened it, there were 50 vehicles parked on the bridge to go fishing for the day in this wilderness area. And more pressure kept developing. This is a political cartoon. When folks found out about it, this is our Commissioner Lavaglio under LePage, and said that Johns Bridge is a clear example of a challenge to strike a balance between accommodating recreational use while preserving the wilderness character of the waterway. And the amount of pressure that was put on those lakes really did distract from the wilderness experience that people spend a whole year planning for. And so one year, there was some migrant workers coming across the bridge, and they went off the bridge, and 14 migrant workers drowned in their van. Immediately, there was a bill put before the legislative committee, to build a cabin here, to put up 14 flagpoles of the countries that these people came from, and a parking lot for people to come park at, while a ranger at that cabin would interpret the people that died. And that's the list of everybody that died. And the bill that went before the ACF committee said that that would all be done. And there's a number of us that opposed it, but they wanted to honor the people that died. And death is a very delicate thing to talk about. And so Natural Resource Council of Maine went down and opposed it. I went down as a retired supervisor and opposed it. And I don't know where it come from. I really wasn't thinking that. But I thought this was just another inroad to try to attack or reduce the wilderness of the area. And I said, why would you want to celebrate where they died? Why wouldn't you celebrate where they did their work where people could go see the timber harvesting, timber stand improvement that they'd been working on. When I said that, 7 Islands did not want that on their land. Immediately that bill was killed, and they never heard anything more about it, except that granite stone that they'd made for this is now at the Ashland at 6 Mile Gate. Passing by Churchill Lake's Borgen Island on the way to Churchill Dam. And this is some of the development the state planned last spring with their $1.2 million. This is a supply barn with a museum here. There's a ranger station here. There's a garage here. My headquarters is over here. They were going to build a new office here, and they're within 500 feet of the river, which is right there. This is the head of Chase Rapids. And so when they were questioned why they needed the office, because North Main Woods collects all the fees and registers all the campus for the state, so why did you need an office for one person that already has an office in his house? And so a number of us fought that, and the department after a while did rescind that order that they are not going to build those buildings. But they were ready to go for it this summer. This is the 4th dam. This one is a concrete dam. It replaced a log dam that was built in 1967. After that dam was built out of concrete, it was realized that they did not have the Army Corps of Engineers permission or permits to build that dam. And these are paid engineers, that's what they're paid to do. And so the Bureau had to pay a fine and apply for an after-the-fact permit. And this is a typical campsite on the Allagash. This is where Chase Rapids starts. This is where the lake portion of the canoe trip stops. Chase Rapids, people from all over the world come to experience it. Rangers will portage people's gear around. This is what Chase Rapids was at one time during the lumbering days. Pretty hard to pass a canoe through that. So rangers will portage people's gear around the rapids, so if they want to run it, they can run it empty, so if they do tip over, they're not going to lose their tent, their food, or any of their equipment. Coming down out of Chase Rapids, absentee mother and daughter having something to eat. Might see a brother and sister wondering what you're all about. I might see a mother loon sitting on a nest. This is a slide we use when we go into schools to talk to the students about how close the loons build their nest to water. They're excellent swimmers. They spend 99.9% of the time of their life in the water, only coming out long enough to build their nest and have their babies. It's been said that they can dive up to 200 feet deep. But Mother Nature, in her wisdom, has placed the legs very far back on their body. But while they're graceful in the water, awfully awkward to walk on land. In fact, you often will see them out in the water basically standing up doing a penguin-like dance. And then you'll see Andy the Moose, he's in one of my books. Paddling down Umzaskus Lake, we pass where we used to live. This was a VIP camp for a National Paper Company before the state came in. And when the people of Maine voted to establish the Waterway, all the buildings on that 500-foot strip were bought for use by the Bureau of Parks. And this VIP cabin became the supervisor's headquarters. It's a place once you only live in once in a lifetime. The sports would be here. They're financial customers, investors. Out here was a kitchen. They had a cork floor so the people preparing meals wouldn't bother the people in the living room trying to enjoy their beverages. And so I went in there in '81, just coming in the driveway, and with the supervisor at the time, Merrill Scott, who's the second supervisor, he was hired after Lee Hoare was fired. And he went in, he said, I'll show you how to light the propane refrigerator. And he said, it's always interesting that you use heat to make cold. Colds, cooling your food or keeping it cold. And so he bent down on the propane refrigerator, and there's a little door that you take off, and there's a pilot light in there, which you have to light. And that pilot light stays lit all the time. And so that when the refrigerator cools, that pilot light will heat up and actually bring cool back into the refrigerator to keep your food fresh. Well, what Merrill didn't know was that when he got down, someone had gone in there and loosened the nut of the gas tubing that keeps that pilot light gas flowing to it. It loosened it. So when you lit a match on you, they had to light that pilot light to get the refrigerator cooling. That copper tubing came off and sent a blaze, a torch of propane flame into his face. Burned his eyebrows off. He fell back using some not very good language. And he immediately poured himself a refreshment drink. And he sat down at the table and he said, this has been going on for 8 years. He said, whenever I leave, I come back and there's water in my gas. My electric line to the generator will be broken. Someone will have gone in and broken into my files. They've broken our windows. I've had flat tires. And he said, I think it's all aimed at me. So if I leave, I think he'll be okay. But he went through 8 years of this. And that was the most drastic part that I'd seen. I'd never seen anything like that. And that was my first day on the job.
We're going to talk about your assignment.
Okay. And so when I was hired to become supervisor, I was given 3 specific assignments. 1, to straighten out a trickster who was thought to be doing all this vandalism tomorrow. 2nd, to manage oversized groups to bring them into compliance. Because if someone can sneak through an extra client, that's an extra $1,000 to $1,200 for them. If instead of having a group of 12, if they can take a group of 13 or 14, that's pretty good money that they can, if they can get away with it. And then there was a main guide that was really raising havoc up there. He was creating campsites where there shouldn't be one. He was going on to campsites that he wanted to camp and drive the people off. He was building buildings where the state didn't want buildings. And he was really the hard guy to deal with it. So those were my 3 assignments. Correct oversized groups that were illegal, bring this trickster into compliance, and straighten out this main guide that had been caught raising havoc. And so I started dealing with the trickster and bringing him into compliance. In fact, he was a ranger on the Waterway. And 2 years after we did that, when my wife was 7 months pregnant, we woke one night to the word that our place had burnt down. And then continuing on towards Long Lake Dam. So we're going to come down to Long Lake Dam, which is at the north end of Long Lake. And this is what Long Lake Dam used to look like. It had a 17-foot head wall of water behind it. This is what it looks like today. There's spikes that keep coming up through this old sluiceway. And this ranger's pounding those spikes down, so anybody canoeing over it won't drive a spike through their canoe and maybe into themselves. And there's a campsite right here, which is gorgeous. If you look up the lake, it's not there. You'll see deer feeding on the buds of the wild roses. You'll see osprey fishing. You'll hear loons calling. You look downstream, you'll see moose feeding, trout jumping, and duck swimming. But the black flies are awful. So my daughter in that book, Heading North, gets there. In the middle of the afternoon, the black flies are so bad, they come out of the forest and they just, basically try to eat the family up. And they build a campfire, put wet leaves and grass on it, try to create enough smoke to drive the black flies away. The flies will not be deterred, so the family goes in the tent long before the sun goes down. The mother and father start reading. My granddaughter who's on the trip, thinking about the journal and the black flies, writes the first poem she's ever written. You coming over to me? Okay.
No-see-ums, gnats, and such. I do not like bugs. I do not like them at all. I don't like them big, and I don't like them small. They bite and chew and fly all about. They crawl in my mouth, and I spit them out. They make me scratch, they make me itch, they make me rub, they make me twitch. I try to get away, but alas, I cannot. No matter where I go, there are always a lot. To these pests, I say, for them to leave and fly away. Do not bother while I am around and visit here when I cannot be found. I do not like bugs. I do not like them at all. The next time I canoe, it'll be in the fall. Olivia Catherine. Oops, sorry, girl.
Yeah, they don't like a frost. Gotta give them a good across.
So this is the old Henderson Brook Bridge, the T13I-12. I always liked it because they took logs and cut them with a chainsaw like shingles because the bridge had tipped so bad to bring it back up. That's now been replaced with a concrete bridge. And I'm working on Allagash Lake when I'm supervisor, and I get a call saying the Speaker of the House would like you to meet him at the Henderson Brook Bridge, this bridge here. I said, okay, so I drive down and I meet him there, and he's there with a whole entourage of people. And he says, I want to build a camp down here, $100,000 camp, and I'll show you. And he said, I think it's a good idea. So I didn't say anything because he was well known to want his way. And so we walked across the bridge and walked about 200 feet down here, and he wanted to build his $100,000 camp within 600 feet of Round Pond on 1312. And when he asked me if I thought it was a good idea, I didn't reply. I didn't think it was a good idea because I knew that man, and I knew it was going to be a party spot. And so these people canoeing the Allagash right in the heart of the wilderness area, supposedly, they'd have that people from that camp walking right through the campsite, which was going to be right near where the camp was going to be built. And so I called my boss in Augusta. I said, what do you want to do about that $100,000 camp that the Speaker wants to build? He said, nothing we can do. If we say no, he will affect our budget, so we will not have money to operate. So we're going to let him do it. I wasn't happy with that as supervisor. I called a close friend of mine, Rick Bennett. He's a senator over this way, I believe now. And he was on the Appropriations Committee. And the Speaker of the House went before the Appropriations Committee at midnight to put this $100,000 project on the table. And Rick Bennett got it killed just shortly after midnight. So that camp was never ever built, but the state did not have the ability to say no to the Speaker of the House because it affected their budgets. And then there's a fourth zone. It's a very complex place that you wouldn't know when you're paddling through it. These are visual areas. And there was a huge complaints about seeing clear cuts from the river. And so the Bureau started thinking about that and working with the landowners. And they thought, well, along the lakes, if there's clear cuts, it really won't bother people because it's going to be so far away. But on the river, it might bother people. So we spent several days in canoes with a whole entourage of people trying to identify from the canoe what could be seen from the water. And in these areas, the Bureau of Parks, Allagash Waterway, can deny forest operations if it's not going to blend in with the wilderness experience. And so that's a fourth zone that's come up. In my estimation, it's just way too complicated on the Allagash, but it's something that needs to be watched and dealt with. And so I'm leading, and every year I would lead 10, 11 people down the trip on some kind of inspection trip. And so I'm coming down with a ranger, and we got 5 canoes behind us, and we pull into Round Pond, and we shut the motors off, and we're looking at the clear cuts and stuff. And I hear a sound over in Squirrel Pocket campsite right there. And I look over my ranger, and he's smiling because he knows what it is. It's the guide I talked about earlier. Okay. And so we went over, and the guide's name, I'll just say his name was Old Guide Frank. I walked onto the campsite, and he's running a chainsaw, and chainsaws are prohibited by others because they like to cut green trees for firewood or make a campsite bigger, or sometimes cut a piece out of the picnic table for kindling. And so I walk on. I've got 11 people behind me watching me. My ranger friend Lee knows who it is. And so I walk in, and Frank's up there with a chainsaw running. I pick up a pine cone, and I hit him in the back of the shoulder because I'm not going to approach him with a running chainsaw in his hand. He turns and sees me, shuts the chainsaw off, sets it down. And I said, what are you doing, Frank? He says, I'm making a hiking trail just up to the road. Ain't that a good idea? Now, Frank, you know that's not a good idea because people going by will park there and come down to the campsite, and they might be taking people's stuff or stealing stuff or bothering people that are camping here. No, that trail's not a good idea. He said, you know, I was thinking what I'd say if you came along and told me to stop, and I figured I'd stop. Okay, Frank, I'm telling you to stop. He said he thought for a moment, and he said, you know, I was thinking what I'd say if you come along and told me to stop, and I'd tell you to go away, mind your own business, and leave me alone. And I said, well, I'll tell you what, Frank, you can cut on that trail all day long, any day that you want. He had me. He knew he got a big grin, he stood up tall. And I said, but every time you start that chainsaw, I'm gonna summon you to court. The redness come up into his cheeks. He looked at me, he said, I've done some research into your family. Your father was a jerk, and he didn't use the word jerk. Your father was a jerk, your brother was a jerk, and apparently runs in the family. And he was so mad, he threw all his gear in one load into his canoe, jumped in, mowed it off across the pond, and I never saw him again. And that was the guy that I was told to straighten out when we first got up there. And then last spring, a report was issued that the feeder streams coming into the Allagash was so hot from over clear cutting that the brook trout couldn't live there. And I actually write a monthly column for the Maine Sportsman, and I mentioned that in my column. And clear cutting issue has gone on for a long time. Here's a letter from 1980. The local guide talked about it. And then in 2024, the Maine Sportsman was arguing for larger buffer zones along the feeder streams for proper management of water quality. Loss of cooling shade along streams affect habitat. Just beyond the mist is a grave by Joel McKeel. He was a huge man. He worked at Cunliffe Depot lumber camps, and when he died, they put him in 2 barrels to serve as a coffin. He was a big man, so they used a molasses barrel for his upper torso and a pork barrel for his lower torso, and they paddled him across the river and buried him for the rest of eternity. And then a few years ago, followers of the Speaker of the House, the one I talked earlier, decided that Joe McKeel wasn't in the right place, which was right out in here. That's where the original grave was. And so they said to the supervisor at the time, that tombstone needs to be moved. And the supervisor said, where should it be moved to? And they looked out in the woods, said, oh, over there, 25 feet. And so they did. They moved the tombstone from Joe's original lifetime residency 25 feet further into the woods. I made an issue of that, and I finally got word from the new supervisor last spring that they've moved Joe back to his final resting place. And then from an abandoned woods road, the neighbors here. This is the old Michoud Farm tote road. Goes up to Ramsey Ledges and up through here. That road was closed many, many years ago. It wasn't needed for logging or anything else, and so we closed it off. Again, that's within about 200 feet of the Allagash River, so we closed it off. And then one day, a friend of mine was up there, and he just happened to drive up that road to go towards the Ramsey Ledge campsite, and just beyond the campsite, here are 2 men opening the road. These were constituents of the Speaker of the House. And he asked them why they were opening the road, and they said, because we want to. And so they went on, and again, I went to the Bureau, and they said there's nothing we can do about that, even though they're on state property. And chainsaws aren't allowed. There's all kinds of regulations that aren't allowed, but they were allowed to give away with it. That was in 2005, actually. And this is the building that they want to put at Michoud Farm. The receptionist currently has a little office right here, and she watches for canoes to come down to stop them from going over 40-foot high falls, which is just down the lake river about 3 miles. But by putting the receptionist building there, she would be out of sight of the river and not be able to provide that safety. But this is another one of those buildings that were going to be part of that $1.2 million development, but now has been taken off the board. And this is an old cabin. You can almost imagine the stories that told there on any given night after a hard day of hunting or fishing or being out in the weather. And the Allagash is recognized as a world-class brook trout hatchery. And anytime I think about that, I think about remembering I saw a letter where the state wanted to stock landlocked salmon in this world-class brook trout hatchery. And I wanted to find out more about that, so I went down to see Henry and Alice Taylor, and this is that same cabin you just saw when they lived in it. And I went down to see Henry, and I said, Henry, what can you tell me about the state wanting to put landlocked salmon in the Allagash? He said, I can tell you all about it, young fella. I'm the guy that did it. I said, okay. He said, I've got to take my morning medicine, pour yourself a cup of coffee from the back of the cook stove, and I'll be right with you. While I'm pouring coffee, he shuffles off to the cupboard in his slippers, throws back the curtain that serves as the cupboard door, and pulls out a pint jar of brown, furry, prune-shaped objects. Do you know what a beaver caster is?
No,
I'll show you. He pulled out a pine jar of beaver casters. These are the scent gland for male and female beavers, and they have a multitude of uses. They can be used to make women's perfume. They can be used to enhance the flavoring of strawberries in some cereal products or other meals. But they have medicinal purposes. If you take a dried beaver castor, like one of these, put it in a liquid, and you let the liquid absorb it, and then drink that, you don't eat the castor, but drink it, it'll lower your heart rate, lower your blood pressure, make you a healthier person. My friends in Allagash Village put their beaver casters into tea. Henry preferred vodka. And that was his morning vitamin. It was a juice glass full of vodka with a beaver castor in it. And he told me the story that when he was a young game warden, he was told to go to Fort Kent, downstream from his cabin, about 50 miles, pick up 5,000 landlocked salmon, come back upstream, and when he got to his cabin, he had to pole his canoe additional 45 miles further to Umzaskus Lake, which we saw a few moments ago. Is Alexander on that? Okay. And when he got to Umzaskus Lake, he had to carry the salmon 3 miles overstream, over through the woods, and dump the salmon into Priestley Lake, and then build a dam to keep them there. That was a state stocking program in the 1920s and 30s. And after he told me that story, he said, Tim, he said, I'm not feeling very well. I think a bad weather front's coming in. I need some more medicine. He had a second juice glass full of vodka with a beaver castor in it. And so we're talking, and he said, did I tell you about the time I tried to fly a live pig in an airplane? I said, no, Henry, I never heard that one. He said, he told me about it, and didn't come out very well at all. And we talked a little bit more, and he said, I'm sorry, Tim, I'll be right back. He had a third juice glass full of vodka with a beaver castor in it. Came back down, sat at the table, got settled in. He said, did I tell you about the time the state wanted to put landlocked salmon in the Allagash? Well, I had to say no. And this time he told me the story again. And in the story, he'd locked 80,000 salmon over 50 miles in a canoe.
Yeah.
And I know you're thinking, we don't have access to a beaver caster, but we want to be healthy. We can help you out with that. In New Hampshire, you can buy Eau de Mist whiskey with a beaver castor in it. It's only $65 a bottle. So if you'd like a couple of bottles, next time we go to we'll pick it up for you. And so the Taylor camp, when Henry and Alice died, there wasn't any use for it whatsoever. The constituents of the Speaker of the House came back. They said, that's like the Taj Mahal. That's a valuable piece of property, and we need to rebuild it. And the supervisor at the time didn't want to say no, because no didn't work with those guys. And so they started through it. And when those guys saw that the supervisor wasn't going to argue with them, they walked away from it and never finished it. So the supervisor, having a half-built building, rather than leave it like that, they did finish it, but it's not being used. Grass is growing up around it, and there's really no need for it. And so we're almost finished with our adventure. We're coming to 40-foot high Allagash Falls. There are two guys in this canoe. They'd come here where there's a portage trail, campsite right over in here. They took all the gear out of the canoe, said, let's do this, jump back in the canoe, paddle down over the 40-foot high falls. His hand's in the air because the current pulled the paddle out of it. He lost it. There's a guy in the bow of this canoe, but he's underwater. This canoe come over that ledge, hit another ledge, and threw those two guys into the pool below. I understand the canoe had his bow torn right off. It was hit so hard. But the two guys got bruised, but they didn't get hurt, and they had to have another canoe brought in so they could get out to town.
And they also won.
And so now the next thing that the folks want to do, well, that's such a nice place, let's build a hiking spot into it so we can hike in with our however many people we want. And again, this is one of the most remote spots on the Allagash right now. There's no hiking trail to it anywhere near it. If you want to see it, you've got to come upstream by canoe or come downstream and enjoy it that way. And so this is another spot to make it a day use area, which I don't think goes well with wilderness. And so what's the suggested course of action? I hope folks will recommend this program to others. This is something I'm going to be taking throughout New England. Join the Natural Resource Council of Maine or the Maine Sierra Club. subscribe to the Maine Sportsman so I can keep people up to date in my monthly column. And then we have letters that we've just drafted for this evening. If folks want to send comments, I'll just share that with you. If we want to send comments to the Commissioner of Conservation, Amanda Beals, and the Bureau of Parks and Director Andy Cutco, so that they know that people care about the Allagash remaining a true wilderness, as voted by the people in '66. And this is our latest adult read. My brother was in Baxter 46 years as Ranger Director while I was on the Allagash. So between the two of us, we have 78 years as conservation officers. And that's our new book. Thank you for coming tonight.
Yeah, thank you.
We do have a list of where we'll be presenting. We have 8 different PowerPoint programs that we offer.